wizard, for I walk in this world. Good morning. I hope this week is off to a good start, and we have some really interesting things to talk about this week. I want to, this week, starting today and then tomorrow and Wednesday, I want to pursue the idea of no fear. We live in a society right now that is promoting fear on all fronts. As a matter of fact, fear is used as a tool to accomplish some things that otherwise would not be accomplished. And whenever that happens, when anybody needs to intimidate other people with some kind of fearful prospect, then there's something terribly wrong. And so there is this call for us in Scripture as followers of our faithful God to be people who are not afraid, ready to stand up to whatever the world brings, because, well, we know that greater is He who lives in us than he who lives in the world. And so we're going to pursue this idea this week of no fear. Now, I understand very directly that there are many things in the world right now that can cause people to be afraid. But again, it's a choice, and we do not have to go down that path. So I want to start today by taking a look at a couple of things that are in the book of 2 Timothy. It's helpful to understand the background of this particular book. Paul, the Apostle Paul, had been arrested earlier and was imprisoned in Rome, but then he was released around 62 or 63 AD. And then he was imprisoned a second time in Rome, and this time it was a much more serious sort of situation. It was under the directives of Emperor Nero. This happened around the year 66 or 67, and at this point, Paul recognized that his time was nearing an end. And so he is writing this book to this young preacher, Timothy, and giving him some encouragement to push forward. This book is all about our struggles against strong and evil forces. And so, very quickly, just let me show you a couple of things. In chapter 3 of this book, we're going to actually go back to chapter 1 to end this, and that's the main point of this. But in chapter 3, there is this warning about difficult times that will come. And it really does sound like some things that are going on in the world today. I want to point out that this passage has always been viewed by whoever is reading it at the current time, whatever century they lived in. They feel like it was written about their time. That's one of the marvels of Scripture, that it always seems so relevant. But what we have here are some very specific warnings about things that will come along later. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Does that sound like today? Well, it certainly does. It sounds like things that we're hearing every day on the news or every day just in our own communities. It seems like that's very relevant, and indeed it is. Now, we have, I think, good cause to read that and say, wow, that really does sound like today. We may have, those of us who are older, we probably read this earlier in our lives and said, wow, that sure sounds like today. But now we would read it and say, those times were nothing like what we're seeing right now. So we have to take a new look at this, as it has always seemed relevant, but to us, it sounds especially relevant for our times right now, the things that are happening every day. But then in chapter 4, Paul is pouring out his heart to this young preacher, because it's almost as if he's giving his last words. And one of the phrases that he uses to carry on the great work that has been started in the cause of Christ, he says to young Timothy, preach the word. Paul knew that therein lies great power, and he was wanting to encourage young Timothy to go and continue the preaching of the word, because in that word is great power, a reason to be able to stand up against the world in the fearful times in which they were living, and interestingly, the times in which we are living. But then Paul also says this. He reaches down deep into his own experience, and he says this to Timothy: "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have loved his appearing." That's about as personal as it gets. Paul is saying that his time is coming to an end. He could see the end of his life coming. And he was evidently fairly certain that his life was going to end there in his imprisonment. And indeed, it did. He goes on in the rest of that, and he expresses his loneliness, because so many of those faithful people that he had taught had turned against him and had even turned away from the faith. And he felt very alone, except for a few people. And he also was recalling great memories. And he was leaning on those memories and the strength of the presence of God to give him strength during these very, very difficult times. Now, none of us is experiencing anything as difficult as Paul was going through right then. But the truth also is that we are each experiencing our own difficulties. So I go back to chapter 1, verse 7. And that is truly at the heart of what I want to say to you today. Because as Paul is getting ready to write all these things, he says this in verse 7. "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." Say that another way. God has not put within us a spirit of fear. We're not supposed to be afraid. He has given us something that overcomes that fear. And it is his very power that is in us, and the power that comes to us through his word. It is the love of God that surpasses everything else. And it is this idea of discipline. King James here uses the phrase sound judgment. But it is, and other translations, by the way, use the phrase self-discipline. But the idea here is that our discipleship, what he has formed us into, enables us to stand up against the fearful world. We are not to be intimidated by this world. There are lots of reasons that we could be afraid, but we choose to not be afraid. And I would urge you this day to start thinking about that. When we look around at the world, let's not be caught up in the fearful nature of everything that is going on today. We have no reason to be afraid. We have reason to be concerned, because indeed our society is going in directions that could ultimately be harmful to our society, to our nation, and more troubling to our own children and grandchildren. And so there are things for which we must stand up. But this world will not intimidate us, because God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Let us be the people who stand courageously, move forward, and act in faith in the ways that he wants us to act, because indeed we are the people to whom the rest of the world is supposed to turn because they see in us the light of God. He didn't make us afraid. It's the world that does that. But again, greater is He who lives in us than he who lives in the world. Make this a great day. And I look forward to talking to you tomorrow about the 23rd Psalm. See you then. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.